Hello and welcome to the Liverpool.com podcast with me, James Martin. Today I'm joined after a short break by Matt Addison. Matt, nice to have you back on. How are you doing?
Yeah, good to be back. I'm not sure the last time I did one of these, but it was a good few weeks ago. But yeah, good to be back on.
Excellent. We'll dive into it pretty shortly. But before we do, just a quick message from our sponsors, NordVPN. To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. And the link you should be able to find in the podcast episode description box. Right. Onwards to business. Of course, the Euros are going on, Matt. I'm sure we've all been keeping a close eye on that, enjoying the football after a short break. And it's all been happening from a Liverpool perspective. We're through one round of group fixtures now, and that means Portugal have finally played. And of course, all eyes in Liverpool, at least, were on Diogo Jota, who did eventually get off the bench, looked to have scored, disallowed after an offside in the build-up for Cristiano Ronaldo, but yeah, it showed his clinical touch again. And I suppose with the debate going on at Portugal level about, does Jota start? How do you get him in? Arne Slot's probably watching it and thinking, I'm going to have a similar dilemma on my hands, isn't he?
Yeah, I would think so. I think Diogo Jota is one of those players that you've got to kind of find a way to give him regular minutes. We've talked a lot, probably over the last 18 months or even 2 years, really, since Darwin Núñez came in, that the conversation with him began pretty much as soon as he arrived about how clinical was he going to be, how many goals was he going to score. Luis Diaz as well, obviously, has had injuries and has been inconsistent in terms of his availability. And when he has been there, he's not necessarily been able to score as many goals as what some people would like. So there's been a bit of a conversation around all of those players, but the conversation is almost the reverse with Diogo Jota. If he's fit and he's firing, you know that he's going to provide those opportunities for other players, but also get on the end of them himself. So I think he is the one that I would try and get on the pitch as much as possible as that number 9. I'm sure we'll have a conversation about Cody Gakpo as well, and I quite like the idea of him being off the left and Diogo Jota being through the middle. But it's a bit of a conundrum and a bit of a puzzle for Liverpool to work out. I think there's probably a strong argument to go and get another forward this summer as well, even though they've already got 5. They've got a couple of young players as well to come into it. But I think for me, when he's fit, Diogo Jota is probably the first choice. The problem with him is, how often is that going to be the case? Is he going to have another 3 or 4 month injury, which he tends to have, more seasons than not that he's been at Liverpool? He's had that. He's had, different injury problems. It's almost the case, I think, with all 5 of Liverpool's forwards, that there's something that you'd like to change about them. Unfortunately for him, it's something that he can't do anything about. You look at Núñez or Diaz, you can think maybe they could take the next step and you can convince yourself of that. But Diogo Jota doesn't have any influence on these injuries that he sometimes picks up. It's just unfortunately something that is attached to his game that you'd quite like to get rid of. But yeah, for me, undoubtedly right up there in terms of the conversation of being one of the best Liverpool attackers and certainly one of the most reliable in terms of his finishing.
But an interesting question, I suppose. I mean, we're talking about him there pretty much as an option through the middle. I know he's played on the wings, but I think we're at the stage where we probably think that's his best position. But that brings him into pretty direct competition with Darwin Núñez. And we've heard from sort of Liverpool of Arne Slot's job is going to be getting the best out of Núñez. Of course, he could be the club's record signing if certain add-ons are met. So that has to be a big priority, especially as we've seen the sort of bundles of potential he has. It's not quite turned into the bags of goals we want to see just yet. But how do you sort of square that problem, if you like, with the kind of getting Núñez the minutes he needs as the younger forward, but also sort of getting Jota, the more clinical one at the moment, into the side?
I think next season it almost becomes a little bit easier for Liverpool in terms of they're going to have more matches that matter. The Champions League, they're going to play at least 3 or 4 really elite teams, which they just didn't have in the group stage last season. There's obviously more of those matches as well, so I think that will play into it. But I think it just, to me, makes sense if you're going into a season where you've got more matches that matter, that you've got basically 2 options in each of those forward positions. I would almost look at it at the moment that you've got Salah to play off the right and maybe you need one more in that position. You've then got Núñez and Jota who can do the middle, and then maybe Gakpo and Diaz share the minutes off the left. And that's not to say that it would be one person gets the Champions League and one gets the Premier League. It would be more a case of one gets an hour and then you can make a change on the hour mark and bring somebody else on for fresh legs and maybe a slightly different option in the final third in terms of the skill set and the strengths that they have in those positions. But I think that's probably how you do it. And that becomes a lot easier to have that conversation. If you're having a conversation with Darwin Núñez about, playing an hour against, Newcastle on a Saturday and then, Borussia Dortmund on the Wednesday or something like that, he maybe gets 30 minutes. It's a lot easier to have that conversation if you're in the Champions League. And I think that's where Liverpool are at now. They've got the depth we saw last season was obviously beneficial in getting through in the domestic cup competitions. And, it took them a long way in the Premier League as well. But I think the Champions League almost makes that conversation a little bit easier because, Cody Gakpo, a lot of his goals and a lot of his minutes in the first half of last season came in the Europa League. That isn't an option for Liverpool this season. They're automatically going to now be in a competition, which is going to be a lot easier to make that argument for him. So there will be rotation. I think there has to be for Diogo Jota for the injury reasons that we've spoken about. But I think if you're any one of the five forwards looking into next season, I wouldn't be worried really about rotation or a lack of opportunities or a lack of minutes. Pretty much always there's going to be one of the five at least who's going to be injured. Even if you're on the bench, you're going to get an opportunity. And if you're on the bench at the weekend, you're probably going to be starting a fairly important match midweek. So I just think there's going to be loads of games, loads of minutes. It doesn't really feel like a problem for me. It feels less of a problem now than it would have done last summer. Yeah,
of course. Not only the Champions League, but the expanded Champions League, as you touched upon there. So plenty of games to go around, you would hope. But yeah, it's worth sort of quickly reflecting on the numbers that Jota put up last season. Obviously, he didn't play as much as anyone would have liked, but he ended up getting 10 Premier League goals. And if you look at Salah, not that much further down the road, 18 Premier League goals, having played, almost every available minute when he was fit. Obviously, he had a period where he was away first with AFCON and then injuries as well. But the disparity, not as big as you might expect from the minutes played. And Jota got those goals, those 10 goals from 5.3 expected goals. So by far and away the most overperforming forwards in the Liverpool front line. And in fact, the only overperforming forwards in the Liverpool front line in terms of that metric of kind of outscoring your expected goals. An interesting thing, though, is that having a look, the next closest was actually Cody Gakpo, which not many people would necessarily have expected. He wasn't always getting in those positions. We know that at the start of the season, there was that experiment with him in midfield, and then he's sort of been moved all over the front line. So it was a bit of a stop-start season. Then he maybe didn't get as many chances as he wanted. But when the chances came, he was putting them away at a reasonable rate. Again, slightly below the expected goals, but sort of in that same region as Salah and a good way ahead of the likes of Diaz and, of course, Núñez. So it's an interesting one with Gakpo. We've spoken about it on the pod before, but how it's probably a bit too easy, if you like, to say Arne Slot's coming in from the Eredivisie. We're suddenly going to see the Eredivisie version of Gakpo. But then you look at the Euros, we're obviously only one game in, but he started that game off the left and once again did look like that version that we saw of him at PSV. He scored a goal. He looked really lively. Do you think, new manager, now is the time to sort of draw a line under the positional experiments and kind of put Gakpo in at left wing now?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the option that I would favour. I think, obviously, without Liverpool having signed another forward, if they were to sign another winger, maybe that would change things, and you might think about things in a slightly different way if they were to go and get an elite player, real world-class operator on that left-hand side, which I think Cody Gakpo could become, but I think it's fair to say in his time at Liverpool so far is just short of that, really. He's very good, but he's still got another step or two to take. So I think that would be what I would look at doing next season. But I don't necessarily think that would come about, as you say, because of Arne Slot or because of the Dutch connection or anything like that. I think it's almost a bit strange that hasn't been the case with him already at Liverpool. I think his best time at PSV was just before he came to Liverpool, playing off that left-hand side mainly. The goal and assists numbers, obviously in a different league, and obviously it doesn't translate immediately across to the Premier League from the Dutch league because of the difference in quality. But the numbers there were really, really good. That's what convinced Liverpool to buy him, and yet we've not really seen him play in that position a great deal, probably because of Luis Diaz. But I think because Luis Diaz isn't ever going to get you a 20 to 30 goal season, I think it's worth a go really with Gakpo on that side. I think he's got more potential in terms of hitting those higher numbers. He offers a slightly different thing. He's maybe not quite as quick and as tricky and skillful as Diaz, but I think that's not necessarily the most important thing. The most important thing is that he can be decisive and clinical when the time comes. So it's definitely something that I would try. I don't think he's a midfielder, Cody Gakpo. I think we've certainly found that with his time at Liverpool. I think he can play through the middle and be very good, but to me, it just makes more sense to put him on that left-hand side rather than Diaz, rather than Nunes or Jota, sorry, and sort of rotate him around with Diaz off that left, because Liverpool have got, the 5 forwards. They've got enough players to be able to spread those minutes across the 3 positions. But to me, you probably get more from Cody Gakpo on the left than you do from the other 2 options that you could alternate in terms of Diaz. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. I think there's probably an argument that you could go and get a real star quality player, Kvaratskhelia. I really like Anthony Gordon. I think he's shown loads of things that Liverpool would love at Newcastle, but short of going out and spending probably 100 million on one of those 2, I think probably Cody Gakpo would be, at least at this point, he would probably be the one that I would start next season on the left with.
And I suppose that does beg the question of Diaz. I mean, we've touched upon that kind of ideal that a lot of these top clubs have of 2 world-class players for every position. And yeah, at the moment, Diaz and Gakpo are maybe checking those boxes on the left. But if we're sort of more or less agreed that on current form, Gakpo's maybe edging that one, and we know that there's this kind of whispers, if you like, of interest in Diaz from Barcelona, from PSG. And then you sort of factor in as well those players you mentioned, Kvaratskhelia, Gordon, and the money they would cost. Is there a sort of a growing case for if that kind of big offer comes in for Diaz? Is that something Liverpool maybe weighs up, knowing that they have Gakpo who can play on the left, and knowing that there's targets out there who could maybe be bought with the money they'd get?
Yeah, I don't think it can be ruled out. It's absolutely not a guarantee, not least because we don't really think that Barcelona have got loads of money to be spending. I think it would depend from their side on having to sell a couple of players, which in the market so far, there's not really been a great deal of movement. I think it's obviously an extreme case with Barcelona, but there's loads of clubs that probably could do with selling a big one before they go out and do their summer business. It remains to be seen really what the landscape of the market looks like. How quickly does one transfer lead to another? It would only take one big one to suddenly, a knock-on effect would happen around Europe. But so far that hasn't happened with the Euros, the Copa America. It probably makes that timeline a little bit more stretched out as well. And the closer you get to the start of the new Premier League season, the less likely it is that it would probably be tempting to go and do something like that. But I think with Diaz, he's 27. He's probably getting close to a point where you think you either sell him or give him a new contract, potentially, I think is possibly the choice within the next sort of 12 months or so. I'm not saying I would be looking to get rid and move him on, but if a big offer came in, I'm not quite sure what you'd be looking at because we don't quite know what the market is, but you're probably looking 20 or 30 million more than what Liverpool paid for him. I think if something like that was on the table, I think you'd probably have to think about it to try and maybe get a player who was 3 or 4 years younger, who was maybe a bit more of a typical Liverpool signing in terms of being just on that cusp of taking the next step and being able to explode in terms of those numbers. There's probably someone out there that you could go and get for similar-ish money in terms of being able to go and do that. But it's one of those really where I think it would be tricky really for Liverpool to find an upgrade without getting a bit of an inflated fee for Diaz. And I'm not quite sure whether you get that inflated fee for Diaz at this moment in time. So yeah, it's one of those really. It's hard to predict exactly what will happen. It could happen that Diaz moves on and Liverpool find an upgrade, but I think that's far from guaranteed. It could happen that Barcelona come in with a big sum of money for him. But again, I just don't know whether that would be the case. The whispers are there for a reason. I'm pretty certain that there is interest from Barcelona. PSG have obviously, they've got that need to go out and sign a player to replace Kylian Mbappe, but would that be as appealing to him? I'm not quite so sure. I think if Barcelona came in, I think it would give Liverpool a real dilemma and really have something to think about. But yeah, it's so hard to predict, really. There's an opportunity there to do something, but I think it would be quite tricky to do in a summer when there's lots of other things to do and probably not that much time to do it. By the time he gets back from the Copa America and his holiday, you're probably looking at a month at the most between that point and the start of the Premier League season. And for me, to be doing it with a couple of weeks to go before the season starts, that suddenly then becomes a little bit risky territory.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree. It's one where the club sort of needs to be ready to react if something big does happen. And like you say, that kind of game-changing bid comes in, but certainly not one where Liverpool would be actively looking to sell. And I suppose we'll be keeping an eye on the Copa America as well. He's another one who often tends to showcase his best form away with his country. And in those cases, you do always wonder, maybe a change of manager, a fresh start. We've talked about it with Nunes, and maybe we could see a little bit of that with Diaz as well. So very much still in the plans as things stand, but it's certainly a situation to keep an eye on. And I suppose it almost brings us back full circle, if you like, because we've been talking about Jota at the start and Portugal, of course, have had the dilemma for a few years now of what to do with Cristiano Ronaldo, this kind of mega star who's obviously very much getting on in years now. And the question being, what sort of value does he still bring to the team? Is it worth him taking up the spot of someone younger? Of course, Salah at Liverpool, a few years younger than Ronaldo yet, and I would say a significantly more effective player at this moment in time. But I suppose at club level, you've got the added dilemma of the fact that you have to pay his wages. And of course, that question is coming up with a year left on his deal. So I suppose looking at the other options in Liverpool's forward line and looking at the market as well, are we at that kind of stage now where Liverpool are sort of reluctantly saying, okay, we need to start succession planning for Salah? And if so, what does that look like? Does it look like a new contract? Does it look like letting him play out this last year, but maybe getting someone in this summer to sort of take over long term? Or if there's a big bid from Saudi Arabia, is it something that could possibly be countenanced, or is that sort of off the table for you?
Yeah, well, let's start with the Saudi bit. I think that's probably off the table because I don't think he would have any interest in it, to be honest. I think there's an acceptance from the Saudi clubs. They would be very keen on him. At some point, I think that's not going to go anywhere, but whether that would happen this summer, I think is incredibly unlikely. I don't really see them putting enough money on the table to be able to tempt Liverpool. And I just don't see the appeal really from his perspective just yet. I think there's still 3 or 4 years that he could play in the Champions League. I think no matter what money you put on the table for him, it's not going to be life-changing money for him. He's already an incredibly very rich man, and I'm sure he'd probably rather, much rather take the opportunity really to lead Liverpool into this new era, extend his time at Liverpool, get all of the accolades and the prizes that he values so high. I think there's not really an argument to be had. But for me, the contract thing is interesting. I think it's almost a bit of a no-brainer for Liverpool. Not necessarily that you'd give him 3 or 4 years and keep him for those 3 or 4 years, but to lose him on a free, I think would just be a bit silly when you've got Saudi Arabian money potentially there in the future. Even if 2 or 3 years down the line it was 40 or 50 million, that could pay for his contract for a year or two. The money that we're talking about is big enough that I think it's worth giving him a new contract, even if you don't intend for the contract to go all the way and for him to be there for the entire period. Almost a bit like what they did with Sadio Mane. They moved him on a year before his contract ended. They got a little bit of money for him, not as much as what they would have got, but at least pays some way towards the wages that you've committed. So for me, there's still a lot for Mohamed Salah to be able to give at Liverpool. I accept that he probably wasn't as good last season and he picked up the injury. But even though he wasn't as good, he was still comfortably Liverpool's best attacker. He was still the most creative player. I think in the Premier League, in terms of the big chances that he created, his assists would look a lot better. If Liverpool had forwards that were able to finish at times, I think suddenly we'd have a very different perspective of his season if that was the case. And okay, he can't be as explosive and he can't beat his man in the way that he used to, but he still scored 25 goals for Liverpool. He still scored, I think 7 more than Darwin Núñez, who was the second top scorer. He's still quite clearly Liverpool's most consistent performer in that final third in terms of the most important thing, which is scoring goals. So there's no way, I don't think, that you can get, even 100 million for him and sign a replacement who would do for Liverpool what he does for Liverpool. I just don't see that can happen at this point. So given that I don't want him to leave and I don't think that will happen, given that I think he's still Liverpool's most important player, that leads you to only one conclusion really, which is try and agree a new contract. And as I say, it might be a new contract for 3 years, but after 2 you cash in and sell in at that point. And I'm pretty sure that the Saudi Arabian interest will still be there at that point. It's just one of those really for me. You've got to weigh up the positives and the negatives, but it's quite clear that there's still a net positive from having even a big contract given to Mohamed Salah. I don't see the need really to sort of upset things any more than what they already are. Not maybe upset is the wrong word, but the sort of transition period that Liverpool are going to be in, even if it's just for a few months under Arne and a new manager and getting used to how things work, to lose Mohamed Salah as well at the same time, I just think would be an absolute calamity of an idea.
Possibly a boost in that regard as well. Liverpool have seen the fixtures for the new season, and I think statistically have the easiest start. So hopefully that kind of transition period can kind of be a little bit sort of ridden out with the help of that potentially kind run of fixtures. I think we're starting at Ipswich, and then from there don't have too many big clashes early on. There's a big game against Manchester United, I think the third game in, but other than that, it looks like a pretty gentle introduction to life in the Premier League for Arne Slot. Before we leave it in terms of the discussion on the front line, I suppose if Slot is going to be planning for a future with Mohamed Salah in the team, which, as you say, seems like the best idea, is that a future where he's the right winger, or is there a conversation to be had about the position? I know it kind of seems strange to say, given that we were running through the depth earlier, and right wing was maybe where Liverpool were weakest in that front line. But what we know about Slot, what he's liked in the past, is that kind of traditional mould of winger with the explosiveness, the ability to beat a man, which we've touched on. Salah doesn't maybe necessarily have quite as much anymore, whereas that creative side of his game looks as good as ever. So if you look at someone like a Lionel Messi, we've seen in the past that kind of transition into more central pockets, sort of number 10. We know that the Slot system has a bit more of that kind of role than maybe Klopp's did. So is that a conversation to be had, or do you think, particularly given the personnel in the squad, that Salah kind of has to stay put for the time being?
No, it's definitely a conversation. It's something that I would like to see a little bit more of next season. I think the number 10 conversation probably comes from, I think people are assuming that Arne Slot will play 4-2-3-1 and have a very definitive style in terms of that formation. I think that's probably been a little bit overblown for me in terms of the way that he'll set up his midfield. For me, it doesn't make sense to make that change and have a definitive 2 and then a 1 in front. I don't think that's necessarily what he's done at Feyenoord either. I know that that's what it looks like maybe on paper, but I think tactically his teams have been a lot more fluid. Even if it is a 2, one of the 2 might be an Alexis McAllister alongside Endo, for example, and suddenly if he moves a little bit further forward, it instantly looks a bit more like the 4-3-3 that Liverpool had with Jurgen Klopp. I think it's probably been overblown, really, the kind of definitive lines in terms of where this formation is going to look. So I don't necessarily see that there will be a number 10 specifically, but that's not to say that there might be certain games where that might be the case. We've seen under Jurgen Klopp, there wasn't too many games where they were behind in terms of the big games, but quite often when that was the case, they would maybe go for a bit more of a 4-2-4 type thing and have an extra player through the middle. It would be more along those lines, I think, where I could see Mohamed Salah playing a little bit more centrally. I've seen, the sort of conversation around him as a number 10. I'd probably see him more of of a number 9, if I'm being honest. I think you can play him in that 10, and I think that's what he does for Egypt. And I think the quality of his passing and his creativity would certainly lend itself to that. But for me, if you're not playing him off the right, you're putting him as close to goal as possible, because he's Liverpool's most clinical finisher. As we discussed before, there's loads of other options that can play through the middle for Liverpool, so I don't think it's a necessity for him to do that. But I think it's certainly a possibility. But it's only a possibility, I think, if Liverpool buy someone who can play properly on the right-hand side. And maybe Luis Diaz can do it. Diogo Jota has done it to mixed success, I think, in the past. Ben Doak obviously is there as well, but we don't quite know where he's up to after the injury. And he's obviously now missed the Euros, and we don't quite know what his pre-season is going to look like. So for me, it's one of those where if Liverpool were to go out and sign the next Salah, who could do a little bit of those Salah minutes and allow him to play through the middle, then I'd be absolutely all for that. I think that wouldn't be a bad idea. It just depends really on what Liverpool's transfer plan is. If they do go out and sign a world beater on the right hand side, then I think that will be something that you could definitely see working. It's just a case of whether that will be this summer or next, really. It's got to happen sooner or later that Liverpool find a succession plan, but it's not necessarily my number one priority for this summer.
And as we said right at the top of the show, I think Jota would be disputing that most clinical finisher at Liverpool claim, but it's one of the two of them probably. So and Salah has a lot of credit in the bank from seasons gone by, so I think he can probably still lay claim to that crown. But yes, it'll be an interesting one. I think we know that Slot isn't necessarily leading recruitment this summer. He's come in as head coach rather than manager, so he'll be working in tandem with Michael Edwards, who's now back in the FSG setup, with Richard Hughes, who's the new sporting director. He's joined from Bournemouth. And so, I think what it will be is a case of Slot will have that period in pre-season, and once everyone's back, to look at the players. He'll want to assess the need. Like I say, it's not going to be entirely his decision, but that kind of question in terms of where we're going to strengthen in the front line, and even in other areas of the pitch, you look at sort of the specialist number 6 has been talked about a lot. And, Slot will have a say in terms of what he thinks this squad needs to be truly competitive. So plenty still to come. We'll know more in the coming weeks, in the coming months. And of course, we will keep you up to date with everything we hear over on Liverpool.com and of course on the Liverpool.com podcast. For now, thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. That's just about it from us. Thanks, Matt, for joining me, and we'll be back very soon. Goodbye.